This is Scott Loveridge with the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. I'm pleased to be your moderator today. We've got a couple great speakers here, and if folks have questions as we move through the webinar, we've got a chat box available to you. Our speakers today are Michael Betz and Jill Clark. Michael is an assistant professor in human sciences and extension state specialist in family and consumer sciences, and works extensively in community economic development and family well-being. Jill Clark is an assistant professor at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, also at Ohio State University, and she works on food and agricultural systems policy, planning, and economic development. Welcome, Michael and Jill.
Sorry about that. So, when we talk about shale energy development, oftentimes, and we're talking about impacts of shale energy development, we talk a lot about the environment, and sometimes we talk about food, but it's often in terms of growing food, right? We talk about farming, and today we're gonna take a different perspective on the food and shale energy discussion by talking about shale energy development and food retail environments. And at the end, we're really interested in hearing from you all online. What do you make of our findings? So we want at the end to have a discussion about, what does this mean for our communities? So to begin with, we want to know from you folks, how familiar are you with the concept of healthy food access? All right. Okay, so I guess we can close the poll, Rosa. And so, healthy food access is something that's actually in policy circles and food policy circles somewhat of a hot topic, as you may know, since you have some familiarity with the concept. But it includes a few things. It's not just access, physical access, like can you get to food, and whether or not it's healthy, because that's kind of another aspect of it. But can you afford it? And is it culturally acceptable? So can you get there? Can you afford it? Do you want to eat it? And is it healthy? And so when we talk about healthy food access, there's actually a lot wrapped up in there. And in the U.S. today, there is quite a bit of discussion, again, in policy circles, whether at the federal level and talking about healthy food financing, or at the local level talking about putting farmers markets in areas that lack full-service grocery stores. Here is a map from the CDC and the USDA demonstrating how they've measured healthy food access. And here you can see they're bringing in a few things. One is the idea of a supermarket, and so the reason we talk about supermarkets is because they tend to have lower prices and a wider variety, including healthy foods. So you've got the healthy and you've got economic access, and then physical access. So they're looking at places that both have high amounts of where people don't own cars, in addition to being distant from a supermarket. Some of our study sites, as you can see, are circled in blue there. And we've seen, the dynamic in the retail industry has been such that we see supermarkets, particularly in our most urban and our most rural areas, going out of business. Part of that has to do with the concentration and consolidation in the retail industry, which results in fewer larger stores. Think of like mega centers. But also, retail follows people and it follows money. And, for the most part, up until the latest housing bubble that we had, most people were moving into suburbs and exurbs. And so, you can imagine that is where investments in retail are occurring. When I talk about interventions at the federal, state, and local levels and thinking about healthy food access and the policies around that, they often focus on the retail food environment. And the retail food environment being that physical presence of all that food that affects your diet. And so that's a distribution of food stores and food service and the transportation networks in between. And the reason to focus on food environments versus simply these kind of place-based issues versus just individual issues when it comes to health is that there is research demonstrating a connection between food environments and personal health. On one hand, research tells us that the presence or the lack of healthy food access. So if you think back to that map I was just showing you where it's further to a full-service grocery store, you may not have a car, that in areas with poor access we have greater presence of diet-related illnesses. And from one perspective, this is an increase in healthcare costs, and so you see some like the state of Ohio getting very interested in food environments because they're looking at what we spend on chronic diseases, diet-related chronic diseases in Ohio as a real cost, and so how can we create better food environments? Now there is mixed evidence. Is this just merely that correlation where people are living in poor food environments, but they maybe already have behaviors that lead to diet-related illnesses versus causal? And so whereas living in a poor food environment causes diet-related illnesses. The jury's still out on that. There's a lot of mixed evidence, but a lot of interest. There is evidence that poor food environments do matter more than healthy food environments. And if you think about some of the images I showed earlier and all the fast food, and there was a little image of a corner store, those have been associated with diet-related illnesses. So rather, it might be unhealthy food access instead of healthy food access that is impacting people's diets. And so these are the reasons why, again, federal, state, and local governments are getting into the business of talking about what can we do about food environments. So we might expect to see changes in food environments and communities experiencing dramatic and dynamic changes in both population and income. And with that, I'll pass it on to Mike.
Mike, you might be muted.
Thanks, Scott. So what I would like to talk about now is the nexus between retail food environments and shale energy development. So I know, Eric, at least you're familiar with shale energy development, and you've worked on that a lot. But just to give others a background about it, in 2014, May 2014, it was estimated that the U.S. had passed Saudi Arabia in oil production. And this is something that would have been unthinkable in the early 2000s if you would have made this claim that in a decade the U.S. is going to pass Saudi Arabia in oil production. And a lot of times with a new technology, there's a lot of hype and a lot of rhetoric surrounding it. For instance, in Ohio here, we had the former CEO of Chesapeake Energy, Aubrey McClendon, say that shale development was going to be the biggest thing in Ohio since the plow. And so sometimes these things can get overhyped. And with shale in particular, it's often referred to as the shale energy revolution. But in this particular case, the ability to extract oil and gas from shale deposits has really been revolutionary for domestic energy production. It's also had a significant impact on the industry, oil and gas industry, where employment has increased 86% in a little less than a decade between 2006 and 2015. However, it's important to keep in mind that the total oil and gas industry is only about 500,000 workers. And in a labor force of 160 million in the American economy, while there might be significant local impacts, the overall impact on the national economy is relatively small. But shale is also having a widespread effect on lots of different counties throughout the United States. Right now, about over 750 U.S. counties sit above shale oil and gas reserves, of known reserves right now. So this is something that is affecting currently and will affect lots of U.S. counties in the future. So just to kind of move forward here, we have another poll. How many of you actually work in an area impacted by shale development? All right, so all three, great. So you guys are probably very familiar with a lot of these things, but just to give a little bit more of a background, there are two particular ways in which we believe shale energy development is connected with food environments. First, through an influx of oil and gas workers, and then also through wealth received by landowners who own mineral rights to their land. And in particular, with employment, these changes often come in two phases. So you have the drilling phase, where there's lots of activity and there's lots of jobs being created. Earlier estimates place this about 13 jobs per well. Now, once the well is drilled, the well is basically just producing and takes very little maintenance. So only 0.2 to 4.4 full-time equivalent jobs are required. The same thing is happening with housing. So during the drilling phase, you have hotels, temporary residential facilities, man camps, campgrounds, and existing rental stock, where most workers are using these things to meet their temporary housing needs. And a lot of times these workers are fly-in, fly-out workers, where they're working 2 weeks in the community and then they're outside of the community. And so the housing needs are particularly important in what types of housing that workers are staying in, because some of these places, like hotels and campgrounds, have very limited cooking facilities and kitchen facilities, and that's going to have an impact on what types of food that these workers are accessing. Now, in the later phases, you might see more people who are in the area more permanently, and so you might have more permanent housing in that situation. With regard to the wealth, payments too also kind of come in two parts. So here you have lease payments, which are upfront payments by oil and gas companies to access the land that landowners have and access the shale below their land. And so not only for drilling, but also for things like pipelines. And then the other aspect of that is royalty payments, where once wells are producing on a landowner's land, they receive a certain percentage of everything that is produced. Payments can be pretty significant. In 2011, lease and royalty payments to farmers amounted to about $2.3 billion, and that's almost half the value of payments provided by the USDA's direct payment commodity program. Flows can sometimes be short-term. So while the lease payments are made up front, the royalty payments come with production, and a lot of times production can decrease sharply in the first year. So in some cases, up to 70 to 80% of the production occurs in the first year. So the production is declining sharply after that first year. So where is shale energy development occurring in the north central region? Here's a map that shows population change between 2007 and 2012. And you guys are familiar that 2007 was the year that energy development really picked up in the Bakken Shale play in North Dakota. That's in the area right here, in the northwest corner of North Dakota. And then also in Pennsylvania about the same time, 2007, in the Marcellus Shale play. That's about the time. So we see population changes, and you can see up in the Bakken play, this dark red area is where there's some of the largest population influxes in the entire region, and that's the epicenter of the shale play right there. So there's also a couple other plays that aren't producing right now. This is the Antrim play in Michigan, and then there's also the plays in Indiana and Kansas, which haven't really produced very much. The play in Ohio started to really develop more so. Both the Marcellus and Utica plays are in Ohio, and the Utica play is the predominant one where a lot of the development has been occurring. But that didn't start until much later, about 2012, so you don't see much of the population changes in eastern Ohio quite yet from this map. So our research questions were, we wanted to find out whether or not the influx of workers and wealth associated with shale, oil, and gas development has changed retail food options available to original residents. And so what we wanted to look at is the two prominent plays that touch the north central region. And this is the Bakken play, as I mentioned on the previous slide, in northwest North Dakota, and then the Marcellus play, which touches into Ohio, but has been mainly concentrated in most of Pennsylvania. And we wanted to look at those two areas and see how retail food environments were changing with regard to the shale development. So in total, in the Pennsylvania Marcellus play, which underlies parts of Ohio and New York as well, we have about 144 counties that we included in our sample. And then we have an additional 34 counties here in North Dakota that overlay the Bakken Shale play as well. And those were the counties that we included in our study. What we wanted to look at is retail food environments, and we wanted to kind of have not just one type of establishment, but we wanted to look at several different types of establishments. So we were able to get industry data of the number of counts of establishments within a particular county. And so we have counts of supermarkets and other grocery stores, convenience stores that are attached to gas stations, and we also looked at those that weren't attached to gas stations as well, and we didn't find much different results. We also wanted to look at warehouse stores and supercenters, so places like Walmart and Target, and then limited service restaurants. And in general, limited service restaurants are fast food restaurants, but they also include things like drive-ins or sandwich shops and pizza delivery shops as well. So those were the four categories of establishments that we wanted to look at that we believe really capture the core of the retail food environment. The key explanatory variables that we looked at was the number of oil and gas workers. So this is industry employment data, and we were able to get data that was specific and precise enough that it is actually oil and gas industry. So a lot of times data, the publicly available data that you can get, is aggregated just to the mining level, what would be referred to as a two-digit NAICS level. And so we were able to specifically nail down that this just isn't mining, which includes coal mining and metal mining and things like that, but this is specifically oil and gas. So we were able to be a little bit more precise in our definition of what constitutes shale development. And then we also wanted to control for other things, other trends that were going on in these counties. So things that would affect the trends in retail food environments like population density, per capita income, poverty. And then lastly, this industry mix variable is just a variable of that captures the different types of economic activities that are going on in the county. So here's our basic strategy with regard to our statistical analysis. Now, what we wanted to do is look at the difference between shale and non-shale areas and over the pre-boom and during the boom period. And this is a pretty good strategy because we can difference out a lot of the effects that might confound our results and take out a lot of the things that might affect the precision of our results. So the boom started about 2007, and if you were coming up with a strategy to figure out whether or not shale development was affecting retail food environments, you might say, okay, let's take a county where shale energy development occurred, and we can look at what the retail food environment looked like before the boom, and then we can kind of compare that to what it looked like after the boom. And that would be a pretty good strategy, but one of the criticisms of that is that if we just looked at, say, a single year, where we looked at maybe 2006, and compared that, which was pre-boom, to a boom year in 2007. One of the problems might be that we're only capturing one point in time, and maybe there wasn't enough time, we didn't allow enough time to see what the trend is over that entire period. So retail food establishments might not have had enough time to kind of pop up in the area and respond to the influxes of workers and wealth in shale areas. So if we just compared one point in time in the pre-boom period to one point in time in the boom period, we might not get an accurate result. So what we did was we took the trend over these periods, and this is kind of, a little bit of algebra up here. We looked at the difference in the stores from 2002, the number of stores, in 2007. And then we compared that to the boom period, so the 5 years after the boom from 2007 to 2012. So now instead of just looking at one point in time, we're comparing an entire trend leading up to the boom and then the trend after the boom. And that's a good strategy as well, but if you're just looking at shale areas, you might be missing trends in the entire industry as a whole. So there might be something unique about shale areas, let's say if they're more rural or remote than other areas. Then we might pick up a trend that is just actually a rural trend. It's not a trend that has to do at all with shale energy development, but it's just picking up a trend of retail food environments in rural areas. So what we do is compare shale areas with non-shale areas, and that's where the name comes up with triple differences, because you're taking three differences. The first difference is the difference between the boom and the pre-boom periods, and then the second difference is the change between the beginning and end points of those periods, so you're getting in the whole trend. And then the third difference is between the shale and non-shale areas. And so what we hope to do is come up with a very precise estimate in looking at trying to get a little bit closer to causality. All right, so what did we find? We found that in fast food establishments, just a little bit of background, there's typically been widespread growth over the last decade of fast food environments, and typically in places with lower incomes. However, when we think about the impact of what is the impact on this on people and health outcomes, there's conflicting evidence between the connection of fast food environments and obesity. So all that being said, what we found was a positive statistical relationship with oil and gas development. So if there was more oil and gas development in an area, all other things equal, we found that there were more fast food establishments. And So there's a couple things going on. If fast food establishments are locating in areas and places with typically lower incomes, this isn't particularly true for shale workers. Shale workers typically have higher incomes than average. So that it might not be the income effect. And we're also getting some income from the wealth effect of landowners experiencing more wealth from both lease and royalty payments. So really what might be the driving force here is the higher value for those workers on convenience. As we mentioned earlier in the presentation, workers might not have access to cooking facilities, and so they're just looking for something fast and convenient, even if it's just something that's very cheap. The second type of establishment, retail food establishment we looked at was grocery stores. And in general, past research has found that grocery stores are associated with BMI. So the closer that you are to a grocery store, the lower BMI that you have, probably through a channel of offering healthier food options and sometimes cheaper food options relative to things like convenience stores. And so those are some of the channels which might affect why grocery stores are associated with BMI. Overall, in the industry, there's been this longer-term trend of grocery consolidation, and Jill mentioned this earlier, that a lot of rural areas are losing their grocery stores. So we actually have a couple counties in Ohio that don't have a grocery store within the entire county. And so people, if they want to access food, they might have to drive 20 to 30 minutes to find a supercenter or maybe a grocery store in another county. Typical grocery store locations are associated with incomes and minorities, so higher incomes in places with less minorities. But what we found is that there was no statistically significant relationship between oil and gas employment and grocery stores. So what might be going on here is you have these two opposite forces of income and higher minorities, and they might be canceling each other out. So you have higher incomes from better paid shale workers and lease and royalty payments, but you also might have higher concentrations of minorities who are migrating into the area to get jobs in some of these support services to the oil and gas industry. We found with supercenters that there was an inverse relationship with oil and gas employment. So this relationship was pretty small, so only counties with large booms were experiencing really small declines. And this could be from local labor cost. If the shale, oil and gas industry is driving up wages for local workers and driving up costs of construction, then retailers might be a little hesitant to locate in an area. These buildings are typically much larger and so require a much larger upfront cost and a much longer time horizon to recoup those costs. So we might be seeing some of those retailers shying away from oil and gas areas. And then lastly, we wanted to look at convenience stores. Convenience stores have increased their food offerings in the last decade, but they're still usually limited food offerings, and they're typically less healthy. Not a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, although there is some of that in some cases. And typically, food is much more expensive in these smaller stores. But we didn't find any statistical relationship with the number of convenience stores and oil and gas employment. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Jill, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of the policy conclusions. Unmute Jill.
All right. Can you? As I mentioned earlier, healthy food access and food environments that support healthy food access are getting a lot of attention at the federal, state, and local levels. Locally, though, since we're talking about the impacts on communities here of shale energy development, I thought I would review some of the policy interventions that have been conducted given retail. So you see that in some communities, they will be working with existing retail. This can be to improve the offering. So, for instance, if we did see an impact with convenience stores, one option may have been to increase the healthy offerings at existing convenience stores. But one of our findings had to do with fast food establishments. So one policy option in the past has been to encourage healthy new retail or discourage unhealthy. And if communities have zoning, that's been one way of discouraging unhealthy retail, particularly focused on fast food establishments. In places that aren't experiencing any changes in population and are mostly experiencing decline in retail because of the rural nature, for instance, mobile retail has been an option. Some communities focus on transportation. The retail environment is been impacted through zoning and public grants, projects and programs, and also different plans. There have also been, if you think outside of the food retail environment, there are some local policy interventions that have to do with impact fees. So, thinking about this intersection between shale energy development and the food environment, we find that shale oil and gas activity is changing food environments in local communities. In particular with fast food restaurants, but with little effect on grocery stores. So, the convenience items are increasing and it's not having much impact on grocery stores. And this might be an opportunity to think about what's the role of local government when it comes to citing either new activity in regards to food retail, or managing current activity, and what are the policy options through, for instance, planning, zoning, which are your typical ones, or through things like community development block grants. So with that, I want to hear from you. Given what we've talked about in this intersection between shale energy development and the food retail environment, we want to hear from you what you think might be implications for communities and options that they might have, or other maybe questions that you.
Well, folks are thinking about that. A couple of questions that I had thought of is one. So you've got these kind of fast food restaurants possibly coming in to kind of tap into the income of the workers, the kind of the temporary workers who don't have possibly good cooking facilities in their man camp, and maybe don't have time, and cooking for one is less fun than cooking for five, and so a lot of factors would cause them to eat at a fast food restaurant, and so there's a link between. But they're doing it temporarily, so there might not be kind of a long-term impact on the workers themselves of doing that. They would go home and eat regular food, maybe other parts of the week when they're off shift. So then there's this effect on the long-term residents of having this fast food restaurant. But you talk to folks in rural areas, about what they want in their community. Oftentimes they'll bring up the fact that they don't have a fast food restaurant. So it might be something they want, even if it's not particularly good for them. And so, how do you react to that?
That's an excellent point. Aside from one of the potential also is to talk about the built infrastructure, and if the demand leaves for that built infrastructure, that rural community might not be able to support the restaurant. So that might be another way to think about this. There are opportunities to, if you do want convenience food options, is to attempt to guide those into healthier options. So not all convenience foods are unhealthy, just as all non-convenience foods are, healthy. And so I think rather it's just starting this conversation about, what does it mean locally, and if a fast food restaurant's desired and they think they can support it without the influx of workers, then, perhaps that is, some sort of benefit from the community. What we do find, though, is that the greater presence of fast food restaurants does have negative health outcomes. That is, in the food world, one of the things that we do know that isn't up for debate as much as the opposite, healthier. So I guess it's a really long way of saying it. These are complicated issues, and thinking about this intersection between kind of temporary workers and the changing food environment is kind of a new research agenda. And so, Scott, your question, I think, is a really good one that we need to think about implications of what we found. I don't know, Mike, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you did a good job addressing that, Jill. And it, like you mentioned, it is a complex issue, and this comes down to what are the wants and desires of the community, and what do they feel like is something that is going to be beneficial for their community. If they see something like fast food restaurant as something that is going to long-term attract more residents and maybe help attract return residents and things like that, then they might weigh the cost and say, yeah, there's some human health costs here, but for the overall picture, this might be a positive for us. So yeah, it's a complicated issue, and these are things that policymakers have to weigh.
Yeah, and I think also, kind of coming at it from the perspective of an economist, you have sort of the fixed cost and the variable costs of running a restaurant. So the fixed cost would be, building this purpose-built structure, which often, these fast food restaurants are pretty specific to the particular franchise that is there in them. And so there's kind of the upfront cost of getting that going, and it's quite possible that the owner could recoup all those costs during the boom phase, and then there'd still be enough business to keep that place open during the non-boom phase. So it's kind of like, if you go through rural America, you see all these churches with, kind of really quite a fast, nice building. Congregation is tiny, and they wouldn't build that building today, but there's enough members of the church who are, attending to keep it painted and pay a pastor. So it might be a similar situation with a fast food restaurant where it would persist for quite a long while, and after the shale boom is past. So you could have these sort of long-term negative health consequences that would persist. On the other hand, they might, as Michael mentions, be able to attract a resident because the next town over doesn't have even a fast food restaurant. So it's, people would prefer to live there. So complex.
Mm-hmm. It is, and you think about also the changing food environment and some of the regulations that have been imposed recently, just things like having the calories posted on the menu board. And what are going to be the long-term trends for convenience foods, and maybe that this is something that in the future it's going to evolve into something that is a little bit healthier and has a little bit healthier options, so it doesn't have quite the negative health impacts that it is currently having, that it possibly is currently having.
Yeah, I think already you've seen some shifts in some of the menu offerings. Of course, I'm an old guy, so I may remember them better than remember what the menu used to look like better than somebody who's a little bit younger. But there was
sure. No, I totally agree. You look at some of the things that Wendy's, for instance, is offering. They've really upgraded their food offerings, and a lot more salads and things like that are showing up on menus, wraps and stuff like that, grilled chicken as opposed to fried.
So it could be that
And I think,
educating the folks about what to choose when they go in there might be helpful.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Jill.
sure.
but I think that one of the issues for me is even just having this on the agenda. That when we talk about what are the impacts, I went back to Choices, the magazine that put out all the recent articles on impacts of shale energy development, just to have the food environment even be part of a discussion, that there's a role for both community and a role for local governance around their food environment, just to have that on the agenda, regardless of, whether I think people should have fast food or not. I think that's probably immaterial. But that it's on the agenda for discussion to even begin with is something that, given our results here, I think is worthy of just even a conversation to see what the priorities are.
Well, I think you've raised a really interesting set of issues, and some careful empirical work to support some of the findings, and so I think this is a valuable contribution to thinking about this topic. I'm not seeing any more questions come in from the chat, so it could be that we're ready for the little evaluation. If the 6 of you who are on the line could fill that out, that would be much appreciated. Get some feedback to our presenters. So while they're doing that, what's next on your guys' agenda?
Well, one of the things related to this is we wanted to extend it to different contexts. So looking maybe nationally, there are lots of different contexts. Obviously, what's going on in North Dakota and how retail is evolving there in a small, more isolated community is going to be dramatically different than what's happening in Texas if you're just outside of Fort Worth. So we'd like to extend this nationally and kind of look at some of the contextual differences across the landscape for shale energy development.
Oh, that sounds great. I look forward to seeing the results of your future.
Yeah. To North Central Regional Center for Rural Development for funding this research.
All right. Well, you're welcome.
Yes, thank you.